audience. This afternoon, I'm going to be talking to you guys about the First Amendment rights and different Supreme Court cases and how they affect us today. The founders of our Constitution had our best interests at heart, but at what point is free speech become hate speech and actually hurt us? People debate all the time on whether this derogatory speech should or should not be allowed. The problem is, a joke to one person may be harmful to another, and vice versa. No type of speech is restricted by the First Amendment, and this is unique to us as Americans as we can express ourselves freely. Words mean different things to different people, and those differences are important to us as a nation. I think being in the communications class as our First Amendment rights are very important to us, as well as being college-age students with rapidly changing opinions. Free speech in all forms has always been protected by the First Amendment, but I'd like to explain to you some kinds of free speech as well as some different Supreme Court cases. The first kind of speech I'd like to talk to you about is fighting words, or otherwise known as insults. These words are defined as written or spoken words intended to incite hatred or violence. To me, this is described as something that you're joking or something that you're messing around with your friend and you can take the wrong way or can be taken out of context. The fighting words doctrine was established in 1942 off the Supreme Court case Chaplinsky v. New Hampshire, where a court-martial arrested a man who was preaching on the sidewalk and told him that he had to be quieter and had to disperse of his crowd. The man verbally attacked the officer and the man was arrested. The case was brought to the Supreme Court after numerous appeals, and the man was held in jail, as the Supreme Court ruled that fighting words would not be allowed in offensive language that was directed at another person in public with the intent of abuse or violence was not going to be allowed in public. This was very, very controversial and a very important part of free speech development in the United States. Then there was the establishment of Street v. New York, a Supreme Court case where a group of men burning American flags were arrested and taken to jail. The men brought their court to the Supreme case as they decided that they would not be allowed in this. They would not be allowed to express their rights of free speech. Flag burning was deemed not to be offensive as it wasn't directed at a person or an individual. So this was a very controversial decision by the Supreme Court, as many of them decided that offensive language could be used as long as it was not intended with violence. Then I'd like to talk to you guys about the difference between threats of violence or illegal crime versus fighting words. There was many different Supreme Court decisions that had a very big impact on this definition. In the RAV v. City of St. Paul, the Supreme Court ruled that words cannot be content-based. So the state of Minnesota had a statute or an ordinance that basically stated that words that were intended with offensive language versus races, genders, creeds, different religions, sexual orientation, whatever it may be, would not be allowed. Someone was arrested in St. Louis or in St. Paul, on this basis for using racial slurs, and the Supreme Court released that man because they decided that the ordinance of Minnesota was not applicable to the First Amendment and held First Amendment rights. Then there was the case of Gooding v. Wilson in 1971, where a cop was called numerous bad names in a public area. This also upheld the same decision from Street v. New York and RAV v. City of St. Paul, where offensive language, no matter who it was towards, as long as it did not incite violence, would be allowed. When I compare true threats to fighting words, I think of the example as teasing a cop on how tough he is versus telling them how you could beat them up. I think this is a great example because it's something that you can joke around with, but someone could take the wrong way and think that you don't mean it and think that you actually mean it in a personal way versus actually telling someone that you're going to hurt them and do personal harm. Justice O'Connor defined true threats in 2003 as statements in which the speaker means to communicate of an intent to commit an act of violence to an individual or a group. This was a very important definition as it defined a very important cornerstone of free speech. Also, the Brandenburg test is used when defining true threats. There's two parts to the Brandenburg test. There's the intent of the speech, which defines whether imminent lawless action will be carried out or is being intended, as well as how likely the action of being spoken is intended. I think this is very relevant to us as college-age students today, as all of us are in universities. Most of us don't think about this, but in school we were taught, don't speak out loud in class, you can't talk at certain times, you can't speak too loud in certain areas. And we never thought about that as our First Amendment rights because we were too young and we didn't know what that meant. But is that really an infringement of our First Amendment rights? Not being able to speak out when we want, not being able to say what we want on the basis that we want? That's for us to decide. Laws have been created for the times at hand, and times and opinions of different people change. The debate on the First Amendment will never stop. But it must be carefully examined, because there is not a set definition of hate speech or what certain words can mean in different contexts defined by the Supreme Court. So that is the question. What will we as Americans decide? When do we decide as a society together that what is right and wrong and what words can and cannot be spoken? Is that even possible? Is that a feasible goal that we can attain? Thank you.